The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Kensington Palace as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly through the ancient stone corridors. His small footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors, a sound that had become familiar to the palace staff over the years. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The young prince had always been known for his curious nature and kind heart, traits that endeared him to everyone from the kitchen staff to the most senior members of the royal household. Unlike the formal protocols that governed much of palace life, George had developed a habit of treating everyone with the same genuine warmth and respect, regardless of their position or title. As he rounded a corner near the East Wing, George noticed something unusual. A new security guard stood at his post, looking remarkably nervous and uncertain. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying temples that suggested years of experience, yet his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his uniform. His name tag read Sergeant Matthews, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. George had seen many guards come and go over the years, but something about this man's visible anxiety caught his attention. Most guards maintained a stoic, professional demeanor, trained to blend into the background while remaining vigilant. This guard, however, seemed overwhelmed by his surroundings. His eyes darting nervously between the ornate paintings on the walls and the approaching footsteps of palace staff, the young prince slowed his pace, observing the guard with the keen awareness that children often possess. He noticed how the man's breathing seemed shallow and rapid, how his jaw was clenched with tension, and how his usually steady stance wavered slightly. It was clear that Sergeant Matthews was struggling with something far deeper than first-day nerves. What George didn't know was that Sergeant Matthews had recently returned from military service overseas, where he had served with distinction in some of the world's most challenging environments. The transition from active duty to palace security had proven more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The formal atmosphere, the weight of protecting the royal family, and the constant scrutiny had triggered something unexpected in the experienced soldier. The silence of the palace corridors felt oppressive to Matthews, so different from the camaraderie and clear mission structure he had known in the military. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threat. Every unfamiliar sound made him tense. The responsibility of protecting the young prince felt enormous, and the fear of making a mistake in such a prestigious position weighed heavily on his mind. As Prince George continued to observe, he saw the guard's hand move unconsciously to his chest, a gesture that spoke of someone trying to control their breathing and calm their racing heart. The man's eyes held a distant look, as if he were somewhere else entirely, fighting battles that existed only in his memory. The young prince had heard whispers among the staff about the challenges that some guards faced when they first arrived at the palace. The head of security had mentioned in passing that many came from difficult backgrounds or military service, and the adjustment wasn't always smooth. Some struggled with the formal environment, others with the pressure of their responsibilities, but George had never witnessed it firsthand like this. The vulnerability he saw in Sergeant Matthews' face stirred something deep within him. Despite his young age, the prince had been raised to understand the weight of responsibility and the importance of treating others with dignity and compassion. His parents had taught him that true leadership came not from commanding respect through authority, but from earning it through kindness and understanding. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated the scene before him, and George realized he was at a crossroads. He could simply continue on his way, leaving the struggling guard to cope alone with whatever internal battle he was fighting. Or he could act on the instinct that was growing stronger within him with each passing moment. The palace had strict protocols about interactions between the royal family and staff members. Conversations were typically formal and brief, centered around specific duties or requests. Personal interactions were discouraged, and guards were trained to maintain professional distance at all times. Breaking these unwritten rules could have serious consequences for everyone involved, yet as George watched Sergeant Matthews struggle with his obvious distress, the protocols seemed less important than the human being standing before him. The prince had always been taught that with privilege comes responsibility, not just to maintain tradition, but to use one's position to make a positive difference in the lives of others. The corridor remained quiet except for the distant sounds of palace life continuing its daily rhythm, kitchen staff preparing breakfast, housekeepers beginning their rounds, and other guards taking their positions throughout the building. In this moment of stillness, George felt the weight of a decision that would soon ripple through the entire palace establishment. He took a deep breath and made his choice, not knowing that this single act of compassion would become a story that palace staff would tell for years to come. The young prince was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful gesture is also the simplest, and that true nobility lies not in following rules, but in following one's heart when it calls for kindness. Prince George approached the distressed guard with the quiet confidence that came naturally to him, despite his young age. His footsteps were deliberately gentle, not wanting to startle the already anxious man. As he drew closer, he could see more clearly the tension etched across Sergeant Matthews' face and the way his hands gripped his equipment belt as if anchoring himself to reality. The guard, lost in his internal struggle, didn't immediately notice the young prince's approach. His breathing had become more labored, and a thin sheen of perspiration had appeared across his brow. The magnificent surroundings of the palace, which should have been inspiring, seemed to press down on him like a weight he couldn't bear. When Sergeant Matthews finally became aware of Prince George's presence, his reaction was immediate and telling. He snapped to rigid attention, his military training overriding his personal distress. His back straightened, his chin lifted, and his hands moved to the proper position at his sides. But the effort required to maintain this facade was clearly enormous, and the trembling in his hands became more pronounced rather than less. "Your Royal Highness," Matthews managed to say, his voice cracking slightly despite his best efforts to maintain professional composure. The formal words felt heavy in his mouth, and George could see the strain it took for the man to even speak. The guard's eyes, while fixed straight ahead in proper military fashion, held a glassy quality that suggested he was fighting to remain present in the moment. What happened next would be talked about in hushed, amazed tones throughout the palace for months to come. Instead of acknowledging the formal greeting and continuing on his way as protocol dictated, Prince George did something entirely unexpected. He stopped directly in front of the struggling guard and offered him the warmest, most genuine smile anyone in the palace had ever seen him give to a staff member. "Good morning," George said simply, his young voice carrying a warmth that seemed to cut through the formal atmosphere like sunlight breaking through clouds. But he didn't stop there. With a maturity that belied his years, he continued, "You look like you might need to sit down for a moment. Would you like to?" The suggestion was so unexpected, so contrary to every protocol that governed palace life, that Sergeant Matthews simply stared at the young prince in bewilderment. Guards didn't sit while on duty. Members of the royal family didn't express concern for the physical welfare of staff members. And conversations between royalty and security personnel certainly didn't involve personal observations about someone's well-being, but Prince George seemed completely unconcerned with protocols in that moment. His focus was entirely on the human being standing before him, a person who was clearly in distress and needed help. The young prince had inherited his mother's intuitive understanding of when someone was struggling, and his father's practical approach to addressing problems directly. "I know there's a bench just around the corner," George continued gently, gesturing toward a small alcove where palace staff sometimes took brief breaks between duties. "It's quite comfortable, and you'd still be able to see this entire corridor from there. No one would mind if you sat for just a few minutes." The kindness in the prince's voice was so genuine, so free of any condescension or pity, that something inside Sergeant Matthews began to crack. The armor of professional distance that he had been struggling to maintain suddenly felt less important than the simple human connection being offered to him. His breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to slow slightly. For a moment, the two stood there in the elegant corridor, surrounded by centuries of royal history and tradition, while a small boy offered comfort to a grown man with the same natural grace that his ancestors had once used to comfort entire nations. The morning light continued to stream through the tall windows, creating an almost ethereal quality to the scene. Sergeant Matthews found himself caught between his training and his genuine need for the help being offered. Every instinct told him to decline politely, to maintain his professional composure, and to continue struggling alone. But there was something in Prince George's manner that made such pretense seem not just unnecessary, but somehow disrespectful to the genuine concern being shown. I'm not sure that would be appropriate, Your Royal Highness, Matthews managed to say, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. The internal battle between his need for help and his sense of duty was clearly visible on his face. Prince George tilted his head slightly, studying the guard with the serious consideration he might give to a complex puzzle. My grandmother always says that taking care of ourselves is the first step to taking care of others, he replied thoughtfully. And I think you take care of a lot of people here, don't you? The simple wisdom of the statement, delivered with such sincere concern, struck Matthews like a physical blow. Here was a child, a member of the royal family, showing him more understanding and compassion than he had received from anyone since returning from his deployment. The young prince wasn't just offering a place to rest. He was offering recognition of his struggle and validation of his worth as a human being. The tension that had been building in Sergeant Matthews' shoulders began to ease slightly, though he remained standing at attention. For the first time since arriving at the palace, he felt seen not just as a security guard or a former soldier, but as a person deserving of care and consideration. Prince George waited patiently, showing no sign of impatience or judgment. His presence radiated a calm acceptance that seemed to create a small bubble of peace in the formal atmosphere of the palace corridor. In that moment, the young prince was demonstrating a leadership quality that couldn't be taught in any protocol manual. The ability to recognize when rules should give way to human kindness, the internal struggle playing out across Sergeant Matthews' face was heartbreaking to witness. Years of military discipline warred with his obvious need for the compassion being offered. His hands, still trembling slightly, clenched and unclenched at his sides as he fought to maintain his composure. The formal atmosphere of the palace suddenly felt suffocating rather than dignified. Prince George, with the intuitive understanding that children often possess, recognized that the guard needed more than just permission to rest. He needed to know that accepting help wouldn't compromise his position or dignity. The young prince had watched his parents navigate countless delicate situations, where the right words could make all the difference between success and failure. You know, George said conversationally, as if they were old friends chatting about the weather, I get nervous sometimes too. Especially when I have to do something important and everyone is watching. He spoke with such natural ease that some of the tension in the corridor began to dissipate. My father once told me that being brave doesn't mean never feeling scared or overwhelmed. It means doing what's right even when those feelings are there. The simple honesty of the statement hit Sergeant Matthews like a revelation. Here was a member of the royal family, someone who would one day help rule a nation, admitting to feelings of nervousness and uncertainty. It was a level of vulnerability that Matthews had never expected to hear from anyone in the palace, let alone from a child who seemed to carry himself with such natural confidence. Sometimes, Prince George continued, his voice taking on a thoughtful quality, the bravest thing we can do is accept help when it's offered, because that means we'll be stronger when others need us to be strong. The wisdom in his words seemed to come from somewhere far beyond his 10 years. As if he were channeling generations of royal understanding about leadership and human nature, Matthews felt something shift inside him. The rigid military posture that had been causing his back to ache began to relax slightly. His breathing, which had been shallow and controlled, started to deepen. For the first time since arriving at the palace, he felt like he might actually belong here. Not because he could perfectly follow every protocol, but because someone cared enough to see his struggle and offer genuine help. The bench you mentioned, Matthews said slowly, his voice still formal but with an edge of hope creeping in. Would it really be acceptable for me to sit there for just a moment? The question carried the weight of someone who had been drowning and was finally being offered a lifeline. Prince George's smile brightened, and he nodded enthusiastically. Of course it would be. You'd still be doing your job, just from a more comfortable position. And honestly, I think you might do it even better if you're not feeling so overwhelmed. The young prince's practical approach to problem solving was refreshing in its simplicity. What happened next would become the stuff of palace legend. Prince George didn't just point toward the alcove and continue on his way. Instead, he began walking slowly in that direction, clearly expecting Sergeant Matthews to follow him. It was an invitation rather than a command, offered with such natural grace that it felt entirely appropriate, despite flying in the face of every established protocol. As they walked the short distance to the alcove, Prince George began talking about the palace in a way that transformed it from an intimidating fortress of tradition into something more welcoming. "This corridor is one of my favorites," he said, gesturing to the paintings that line the walls. "These portraits are of my ancestors, but I like to think of them as family members who just happen to be watching over everyone who works here." The casual way he spoke about the imposing royal portraits made them seem less like stern judges and more like benevolent guardians. Sergeant Matthews found himself looking at the paintings with new eyes, seeing wisdom and kindness in faces that had previously seemed cold and forbidding. When they reached the small alcove, Prince George gestured toward the simple wooden bench that sat beneath a tall window. "This spot gets lovely morning light," he said, as if he were showing a guest to the best seat in his home. "And you can see both ends of the corridor perfectly from here. I sometimes sit here myself when I need to think about something important." The revelation that the young prince also used this space for quiet reflection made it feel less like a hiding place and more like a legitimate part of the palace's daily rhythm. Matthews slowly lowered himself onto the bench, his legs trembling slightly as the adrenaline that had been keeping him upright began to fade. The moment he sat down, a wave of relief washed over him that was almost overwhelming. The simple act of taking the weight off his feet allowed some of the tension to leave his body. His breathing became easier, and for the first time in hours, he felt like he could think clearly. Prince George remained standing nearby, not in a way that felt like he was watching or judging, but more like a friend who was simply keeping someone company during a difficult moment. His presence was comforting rather than intimidating, and Matthews felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. "Thank you," Matthews said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer hide. I haven't been sleeping well since I started here. Everything feels so formal and important, and I keep worrying that I'll make a mistake that could put you or your family in danger." The honesty of the confession surprised even Matthews himself. He had never intended to share his fears with anyone, least of all a member of the royal family. But something about Prince George's gentle presence made it feel safe to be vulnerable, to admit that even strong, experienced people sometimes struggled with new challenges. Prince George listened to Sergeant Matthews' confession with the kind of focused attention that adults rarely gave to each other's problems. His young face showed no trace of judgment or surprise, only genuine concern and understanding. When Matthews finished speaking, the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable but rather peaceful, like the quiet that comes after finally sharing a burden that has been carried alone for too long. "You know what I think?" Prince George said softly, settling down beside Matthews on the bench, despite every protocol that would normally prevent such casual interaction. His small presence next to the large, uniformed guard created a touching contrast that somehow made perfect sense in that moment. "I think you care so much about keeping us safe that you're making yourself sick with worry." The simple observation cut straight to the heart of Matthew's struggle. The guard turned to look at the young prince, struck by the clarity of his understanding. Here was someone who could see past the surface anxiety to the deeper motivation beneath it. Matthews had been so focused on his fear of failing that he had lost sight of the fact that his very concern demonstrated his commitment to his duty. "My mother always tells me that when we care deeply about something, it can make us feel scared sometimes," George continued, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had clearly spent time thinking about such things. She says the trick is to remember that caring is actually our strength, not our weakness. It means we'll work harder and pay more attention than people who don't care as much. Matthews felt a shift in his perspective, like a door opening in his mind that he hadn't even known was closed. The anxiety that had been paralyzing him began to transform into something more manageable. His care for the royal family's safety was indeed his greatest strength as a guard. The fear of making mistakes was actually evidence of his dedication, not proof of his inadequacy. The first few weeks in any new job are always the hardest, Prince George said with surprising authority for someone his age. Even I felt nervous when I first started attending official events. All those people watching, all those rules to remember. But everyone here wants you to succeed, Sergeant Matthews. We're all on the same team. The idea of being part of a team rather than an isolated individual trying to prove himself worthy transformed Matthews' entire understanding of his role at the palace. He wasn't an outsider being tested and judged. He was a valued member of a group dedicated to the same goals he held dear. The realization brought a warmth to his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun streaming through the window. As they sat together on the bench, Prince George began sharing stories about the palace staff that gradually painted a picture of a close-knit community rather than a rigid hierarchy. He told Matthews about the head chef who had been so nervous during his first state dinner that he had accidentally served the soup course twice, and how everyone had simply adapted and made it work. He described the housekeeping supervisor who had gotten lost in the palace's many corridors during her first month and had been found hours later, still carrying her cleaning supplies and looking embarrassed. Each story served a purpose beyond mere entertainment. Prince George was showing Matthews that everyone who worked at the palace had experienced moments of uncertainty and imperfection, and that these human moments didn't diminish their value or their place in the royal household. The young prince had an intuitive understanding that people needed to feel connected to others' experiences in order to feel less alone in their own struggles. The thing about working here, George said thoughtfully, is that it's not really about being perfect. It's about caring enough to keep trying to do better and being part of something bigger than just yourself. He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. You've already shown you care by being so worried about doing well. That's actually the most important qualification for this job. Matthews found himself nodding, feeling more grounded than he had since arriving at the palace. The young prince's words were helping him see his situation from an entirely new angle. Instead of focusing on all the ways he might fail, he could focus on the dedication and experience he brought to his role. His military background wasn't something to overcome. It was an asset that made him particularly qualified to protect the royal family. I served overseas for 3 tours, Matthews found himself saying, surprising himself again with his willingness to share personal information. I've been in situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death for my fellow soldiers. But somehow, standing in this beautiful, peaceful place feels more frightening than any battlefield ever did. Prince George nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to him. I think maybe it's because on the battlefield you knew exactly what your job was and how to do it. Here, everything feels different, so you're not sure if your skills still apply. But protecting people is protecting people, isn't it? The setting might be different, but the heart of what you're doing is exactly the same. The profound simplicity of this observation struck Matthews like a thunderbolt. His skills, his instincts, his dedication to keeping others safe, none of that had changed when he traded his military uniform for palace security attire. The core of who he was as a protector remained exactly the same. Only the environment had changed, and environments could be learned and adapted to with time. For the first time since arriving at the palace, Sergeant Matthews felt his shoulders truly relax. The crushing weight of inadequacy that had been pressing down on him began to lift, replaced by a growing sense of confidence and purpose. He was still the same capable, dedicated professional he had always been. He just needed time to adjust to new surroundings and new protocols. "Thank you," he said to Prince George, his voice stronger and more certain than it had been all morning. "I think I was so focused on being afraid of letting everyone down that I forgot to trust in my ability to learn and adapt." You've reminded me that I'm here because people believe in me, not because I need to prove I'm worthy of being here." The transformation in Sergeant Matthews was remarkable to witness. Color had returned to his face, his breathing had steadied, and the tremor in his hands had almost completely disappeared. Prince George watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, pleased to see that his simple act of kindness was having such a profound effect. But what the young prince didn't anticipate was that their conversation was about to be observed by others. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, and both Prince George and Sergeant Matthews turned to see who was coming. Walking toward them with measured, authoritative strides was Colonel Harrison, the head of palace security. His expression was stern and focused, the look of someone who had noticed an irregularity in the palace's carefully orchestrated daily routine and intended to address it immediately. Colonel Harrison was a man who had spent his entire career in service to the royal family, first in the military and then in his current role overseeing all security operations at the palace. He was respected by everyone who worked under him, but he was also known for his unwavering commitment to protocol and proper procedure. The sight of a guard sitting down while on duty, especially in the company of a member of the royal family, was unprecedented and deeply concerning to him. As he drew closer, Colonel Harrison's trained eye took in every detail of the scene before him. Prince George sitting casually on a bench beside a uniformed guard, both of them appearing to be engaged in friendly conversation. It was exactly the kind of informal interaction that security protocols were designed to prevent, not because of any malicious intent, but because it represented a breakdown in the professional boundaries that were considered essential for effective protection. Sergeant Matthews noticed the approaching colonel first, and his newly found calm immediately evaporated. The panic that Prince George had worked so carefully to dispel came flooding back as Matthews recognized the implications of being found in such a compromising position. His military training kicked in, and he began to rise from the bench, his movements sharp and filled with the tension of someone who knew he was about to face serious consequences. "Sergeant Matthews," Colonel Harrison called out when he was still several feet away, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of authority and disapproval. "What is the meaning of this? You are supposed to be at your assigned post, not sitting down during duty hours." His words were clipped and professional, but they carried the weight of disappointed expectations and serious concern about protocol violations. The blood drained from Matthew's face as he snapped to attention, his back rigid and his eyes fixed straight ahead in the manner of a soldier facing disciplinary action. All the progress he had made during his conversation with Prince George seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by the crushing fear that his career at the palace was about to end before it had truly begun. But Prince George, despite his young age, understood exactly what was happening and what needed to be done. Rising gracefully from the bench, he positioned himself slightly between the colonel and the guard, not in a confrontational way, but in a manner that made it clear he intended to take responsibility for the situation. His posture straightened, and suddenly he carried himself with all the natural authority of his royal birthright. "Colonel Harrison," Prince George said, his voice clear and confident, carrying none of the casualness that had characterized his conversation with Matthews. "I asked Sergeant Matthews to accompany me to this location. He was feeling unwell, and I was concerned for his welfare." The young prince's words were carefully chosen, technically accurate, while also providing a framework that made the guard's actions seem not just acceptable but necessary. The colonel paused mid-stride, clearly not having expected this response. In all his years of service, he had never encountered a situation where a member of the royal family had directly intervened to explain or justify the actions of security personnel. The protocol manuals contained no guidance for such a scenario, leaving him temporarily uncertain about how to proceed. Prince George continued before Colonel Harrison could formulate a response. "I believe that ensuring the well-being of the people who protect us is just as important as following standard procedures." Sergeant Matthews was clearly struggling, and I felt it was my responsibility to make sure he received the support he needed. The maturity and thoughtfulness of his explanation were striking. demonstrating a level of leadership that went far beyond his years. Colonel Harrison found himself in an unprecedented position. On one hand, his duty was to maintain security protocols and ensure that all guards performed their duties according to established standards. On the other hand, he was being directly addressed by a member of the royal family who was not only explaining the situation but also articulating a philosophy of leadership that was both compassionate and strategically sound. "Your Royal Highness," Colonel Harrison said carefully, his tone shifting to one of respectful attention rather than authoritative correction. "While I understand your concern for Sergeant Matthews' well-being, there are proper channels for addressing such issues. Guards who are feeling unwell should report to their supervisors so that appropriate accommodations can be made." Prince George nodded thoughtfully, acknowledging the validity of the colonel's point without backing down from his position. "You're absolutely right about the proper channels, Colonel. But sometimes situations arise that require immediate attention. Sergeant Matthews wasn't just feeling physically unwell. He was experiencing the kind of stress that could potentially impact his ability to perform his duties effectively. I felt that addressing the situation immediately was the most responsible course of action." The young prince's ability to frame his intervention in terms of security effectiveness rather than mere compassion was masterful. He had taken what could have been seen as a breach of protocol and recontextualized it as a proactive measure to ensure the continued safety of the royal family. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that Colonel Harrison had to respect, even if the execution had been unconventional. Sergeant Matthews stood frozen throughout this exchange, hardly daring to breathe as his fate was being determined by forces beyond his control. The kindness Prince George had shown him was now being put to the ultimate test, and he could only hope that the young prince's intervention would be enough to save his position at the palace. Colonel Harrison stood in thoughtful silence for several long moments, his experienced mind working through the implications of what Prince George had said. The young prince waited patiently, showing none of the fidgeting or impatience that might be expected from someone his age in such a tense situation. His calm confidence seemed to fill the corridor, creating a space where thoughtful consideration could take precedence over immediate reaction. During this pause, other staff members had begun to notice the unusual gathering in the alcove. Kitchen staff on their way to prepare breakfast, housekeepers beginning their morning routines, and additional security personnel all found reasons to pass through the corridor more slowly than usual. Word of the unprecedented interaction between Prince George and the new guard had begun to spread through the palace's informal communication network, though no one dared to openly stare or interrupt. "Sergeant Matthews," Colonel Harrison finally said, his voice softer than before but still maintaining its authoritative tone, "is what His Royal Highness has described accurate? Were you experiencing difficulties that impacted your ability to perform your duties?" The question was asked without accusation, but it required complete honesty, and everyone present understood the weight of the moment. Matthews straightened even further, if such a thing was possible, and met the colonel's eyes directly. "Yes, sir," he said clearly. "I was experiencing significant anxiety and stress that was affecting my concentration and physical stability. Prince George noticed my distress and offered assistance. His intervention was both timely and necessary." The honesty in his voice was unmistakable, as was his willingness to take full responsibility for his condition while acknowledging the help he had received. Prince George added quietly, "Colonel Harrison, I hope you'll consider that Sergeant Matthews' willingness to accept help when he needed it actually demonstrates the kind of judgment we want in someone responsible for our safety. Someone who continues to struggle alone when assistance is available might make poor decisions in critical moments." The wisdom of this observation struck Colonel Harrison immediately. Throughout his career, he had seen situations where pride or stubbornness had led to poor outcomes that could have been avoided if people had been willing to acknowledge their limitations and seek support. Prince George was essentially arguing that Matthews had demonstrated good judgment rather than weakness by accepting help when it was offered. Furthermore, Prince George continued, his voice gaining confidence as he saw the colonel's receptive expression. "I believe this experience has given Sergeant Matthews valuable insight into the palace environment and the support systems available here. Rather than being a mark against him, it could be seen as an accelerated orientation process that will make him more effective in his role going forward." The young prince's ability to reframe the entire situation as a positive learning experience rather than a disciplinary matter was remarkable. He had taken what could have been a career-ending incident and transformed it into a demonstration of effective problem-solving and community support. Colonel Harrison found himself genuinely impressed by the strategic thinking being displayed by someone who wouldn't turn 11 for several more months. "Your Royal Highness," Colonel Harrison said formally, "your perspective on this matter is both thoughtful and valuable. However, I must ask, what made you feel qualified to assess and address Sergeant Matthews' condition? Such interventions typically require training and experience that—" He paused, clearly struggling to find a diplomatic way to suggest that a 10-year-old boy might have been out of his depth in dealing with an adult's psychological distress. Prince George smiled at the question, showing no offense at the implied concern about his qualifications. "You're absolutely right to ask about that, Colonel. I'm certainly not trained in crisis intervention or psychological support, but I didn't need special training to recognize that someone was in distress and needed basic human kindness. Sometimes the most effective help is simply showing someone that they're not alone and that others care about their well-being." The simplicity and truth of this statement resonated through the corridor. Several of the staff members who had been discreetly observing the conversation found themselves nodding slightly in recognition of the fundamental wisdom being expressed. Human connection and compassion didn't require credentials or training. They required only the willingness to see others' pain and respond with kindness. Colonel Harrison felt something shift inside him as he considered Prince George's words. Throughout his career, he had focused primarily on procedures, protocols, and security measures. While these elements were undoubtedly important, he was beginning to recognize that he might have overlooked the equally crucial element of human welfare and community support within his security framework. "Sergeant Matthews," Colonel Harrison said, turning his full attention to the guard, "I want you to know that seeking help when you need it is not a sign of weakness or failure. In fact, I'm implementing a new policy effective immediately. All new security personnel will be assigned a mentor from among our experienced staff, and regular check-ins will be scheduled during the first month of service to ensure that any adjustment difficulties are addressed promptly and supportively." The announcement sent ripples of surprise and approval through the gathered staff members. Colonel Harrison was not known for making spontaneous policy changes, especially ones driven by emotional considerations rather than security requirements. Yet here he was, demonstrating the same kind of adaptive leadership that Prince George had shown in responding to Matthew's crisis. Matthews felt a wave of relief so profound that his knees nearly buckled. Not only was he not being dismissed, but his experience was being used as the foundation for positive changes that would help future guards avoid the struggles he had faced. The shame and fear that had been consuming him began to transform into a sense of purpose and belonging. "Thank you, sir," Matthews said, his voice thick with emotion. "And thank you, Your Royal Highness. I will not forget the kindness you've shown me today, and I promise to honor it by being the best guard I can possibly be." His words carried the weight of someone who had been given a second chance and intended to make the most of it. Prince George beamed with genuine pleasure at this outcome. His simple act of compassion had not only helped one person through a difficult moment, but had also inspired systemic changes that would benefit many others in the future. The young prince was beginning to understand that leadership wasn't just about making decisions or giving orders. It was about creating environments where people could thrive and support each other. As the formal conversation concluded and Colonel Harrison began to disperse the gathered staff members, Prince George made one final gesture that would cement this moment in palace history. rather than simply walking away now that the crisis had been resolved. He turned back to Sergeant Matthews with a warm smile and extended his hand for a handshake. The offer of a handshake between a member of the royal family and a palace guard was virtually unprecedented. Such casual, egalitarian gestures were generally reserved for visiting dignitaries or important guests, not for staff members during routine interactions. Yet Prince George offered his hand with the same natural grace he had shown throughout the entire encounter, as if this were simply the appropriate way to conclude their conversation. Sergeant Matthews looked uncertainly between the offered hand and Colonel Harrison, clearly unsure whether accepting such a gesture would be appropriate. But the colonel nodded slightly, understanding that this moment transcended normal protocol and deserved to be honored according to Prince George's wishes rather than standard procedure. When Matthews finally clasped the young prince's hand, the handshake was firm and genuine, carrying the weight of mutual respect and shared understanding. In that simple gesture, Prince George was communicating that he saw Matthews not as a servant or subordinate, but as an equal human being deserving of dignity and respect. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. "I hope you'll feel comfortable coming to me if you ever need someone to talk to again," Prince George said quietly as they shook hands. "Sometimes it helps to have a friend who understands what it's like to feel overwhelmed by big responsibilities." The offer of ongoing friendship was as unprecedented as everything else that had happened that morning. Yet it felt entirely natural coming from him. As Prince George finally continued on his way through the palace corridors, the atmosphere he left behind was markedly different from what it had been an hour earlier. The rigid formality that typically characterized palace interactions had been softened by an injection of genuine, human warmth and compassion. Staff members who had witnessed the exchange were already discussing it in hushed, amazed tones, marveling at the young prince's maturity and kindness. Colonel Harrison found himself walking alongside Sergeant Matthews as they headed back toward the guard's assigned post. "I want you to know," the colonel said quietly, "that what happened here today has given me a great deal to think about. Prince George has reminded me that our primary mission is to protect the royal family. But part of that protection involves ensuring that the people responsible for their safety are healthy, supported, and able to perform at their best." Matthews nodded gratefully, feeling more grounded and confident than he had since arriving at the palace. The conversation with Prince George had not only addressed his immediate crisis, but had also fundamentally changed his understanding of his place within the palace community. He was no longer an outsider trying to prove his worth. He was a valued member of a team dedicated to shared goals. Over the following days and weeks, the story of Prince George's gentle intervention spread throughout the palace with the kind of reverent detail usually reserved for historical events. Staff members who hadn't been present that morning heard multiple versions of the tale, each one emphasizing different aspects of the young prince's wisdom and compassion. The story became a touchstone for discussions about leadership, kindness, and the importance of supporting one another through difficult times. The new mentorship program that Colonel Harrison implemented became highly successful, with experienced guards volunteering eagerly to support new staff members through their adjustment periods. Several guards who had been struggling silently with various challenges came forward to seek help. Inspired by Matthew's example and reassured by the supportive response it had received, Sergeant Matthews himself flourished in his role, becoming one of the most dedicated and effective members of the security team. The confidence he gained from Prince George's support, combined with his military experience and natural protective instincts, made him an invaluable asset to palace security. More importantly, he made it his personal mission to watch for other staff members who might be struggling, and to offer the same kind of support that had been given to him. Prince George, for his part, seemed to take the entire experience in stride, as if acts of extraordinary kindness were simply part of his daily routine. But those closest to him noticed that the incident had reinforced his natural inclination toward compassionate leadership. He continued to treat all palace staff with the same warmth and respect he had shown to Matthews, creating an atmosphere of mutual care that enhanced rather than diminished The dignity of royal protocol. The bench in the small alcove, where Prince George and Sergeant Matthews had their life-changing conversation, became something of an informal landmark within the palace. Staff members would occasionally sit there during breaks, and new guards were often told the story of what had happened in that spot. It served as a tangible reminder that even within the formal structure of royal protocol, there was always room for human kindness and genuine care. Years later, when historians would write about Prince George's development as a future leader, many would point to this incident as an early indication of his character and leadership philosophy. The story demonstrated that true nobility wasn't about maintaining distance from others, but about using one's position and privilege to lift others up during their moments of need. The gentle action that had initially stunned the palace had, in the end, created ripples of positive change that extended far beyond that single morning. It became a defining moment that illustrated how one person's compassion could transform not just an individual life, but an entire community's approach to supporting and caring for one another.